Ruth in your Bibles. Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth, just before 1 Samuel. The English Bibles follow the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, and the Latin Vulgate follows that. And the reason that we in the English Bibles have Ruth placed where it's at in the book of Judges is because it says in chapter 1, verse 1, it came about in the days when the judges governed. But if you were to look in the Hebrew Bibles puts Ruth in the section where Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs are. So it puts them in that category of literature. But since we had the Septuagint, ever since the Septuagint, they placed Ruth next to Judges because it happened during the period of the Judges. So if you were ever looking at a Hebrew Bible or a Bible that's arranged according to Hebrew order, you're not going to find Ruth in the place that you normally would. What's normal to us because they arrange their books a little bit different. There's also no such thing as 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They have different names for those books as well. We're in chapter 4. We just began chapter 4 last week. Chapter 3 left matters concerning Naomi and Ruth in the hands of Boaz. Everything is in his hands. And this final act that we have here in chapter 4 brings the story of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz to a remarkable conclusion. There are two scenes in chapter 4. The first is in verses 1 through 12, and it takes place at the city gates. And the second, in verses 13 through 17, is parallel to chapter 1, verses 19 through 22. In chapter 1, verses 19 through 22, Naomi spoke her tale of bereavement and loss to the women of Bethlehem. Remember, don't call me Naomi, which means happy, but call me Mara, which means bitter, for the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. Now, the women of the town, in chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, the women of the town celebrate the son born to Boaz and Ruth as the one who restores life and fullness to Naomi. In that sense, it's parallel to chapter 1, verses 19 through 22. The first scene in chapter 4 divides into 3 episodes. Verses 1 and 2, Boaz convenes a legal assembly. And then verses 3 through 8, Boaz negotiates with the closer relative. And in verses 9 through 12, the legal assembly endorses the agreement and blesses Boaz. We will get through verse 8 tonight, I think. We'll see. There's no time limit, and should the Lord return before next Sunday, that's good. We'll know everything when we get in front of His presence anyway. But we'll try to get to verse 8 tonight. In verses 1 and 2, Boaz went up to the gate, sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. He took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Kind of as a matter of fact, telling the story here. Now there is an interval of time between the events of chapter 3 to Boaz walking to the gate. Walking to the gate is a new scene, and we see that expression of Boaz in chapter 3 and verse 13. He says, "Remain this night, and when the morning comes, if he will redeem you, this closer relative, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to, then I will redeem you as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning." So he's at the gate the very next morning. So there is a small interval of time, but not much. When he says, lie down here until morning, you know it's the next day. So we're just talking a few hours here between chapter 3 and chapter 4. Naomi's confidence is expressed in chapter 3, verse 18, when she says, "Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man," that is Boaz, "will not rest until he has settled it today." So when you see Naomi's confidence and you see Boaz's words, "lie down until morning," you know that it was very soon. We're not talking a week later or even 2 days later. It's the very next morning. And Naomi's confidence in Boaz was well placed. He gets up the next morning and he goes to the gate and he sits down at the gate. Now everybody who goes in and out of the town has to go through this gate. So eventually he's going to meet this close relative. So evidently and apparently the close relative does come through the gate, and Boaz asks him to sit down, and his name is not given. We have it in New American Standard translated friend. Sometimes it's translated in different versions as so-and-so. It's a word play. And I mentioned last week, literally, the Hebrew is Almoni Poloni. Almoni Peloni. Almoni Poloni. In English, hodgepodge. Sit down here, so-and-so. And so the author doesn't care at all to give the name of the man. And what his motives are, we're not real sure why he doesn't do that. But there's nothing here. And this idiom, this Almoni Poloni here, occurs in two other passages where it's clear that the author doesn't want to give the name of the place, such and such place, in 1 Samuel 21 and 2 Kings chapter 6. Usually the author is careful with names, but here he keeps the close relative anonymous. Obviously, Boaz knows the man. Whatever the reason for him not sharing the name here, the effect is to diminish the respect in the reader's mind. This guy doesn't factor. He's here. He comes through the gate. We need to have a discussion with him. And then just as soon as he shows up, he goes away. So he's not important. And we see also that Boaz is not passive in finding the elders as he had been in finding the close relative. He was passive. He sat down there and waited. But he went out proactively and gathered 10 guys around. He took 10 men of the elders. And that suggests that he simply did not wait at the gate, but he called them. A translation would be, he had them brought, is likely the sense here. So he is a man who owns land, and he's well thought of, and he knows what the townspeople said, because he said, all my people know you are a woman of excellence. So he knows what's going on, and they respect him. There's a measure of respect, and so he took 10 men of the elders. He called them. He brought them here. And the number of 10 is likely reflecting the care and the seriousness of the matter. Boaz was very careful to make sure that there would be no questions regarding the legality of what's about to take place. So now we begin with the negotiations in verses 3 through 8. There's the first round in verses 3 through 4, and the second round in verses 5 through 8. So let's read verses 3 through 8. Then he said to the closest relative, Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you. And he said, I will redeem it. So there's the first round of negotiations. He's agreed, I'm going to redeem it. There's more. Verse 5. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. The closest relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself, and you may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and the exchange of land to confirm any matter. Here's what it is. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the manner of attestation in Israel. So the closest relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself. And he removed his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders, and that gets into the next round of negotiations. So, what in the world is going on here? It seems like Boaz would mention Ruth right from the very start, but he doesn't. He mentions the land, and then he springs Ruth on him in verse 5. Okay, but you also agree to do this. Then he backs out. So what's going on? Let's see about this. Well, the assembly that he's gathered now is positioned to hear the witness to hear all these things and witness the case from Boaz. He's got these 10 men around. He has the closest relative, and they're somewhere around the gate. To us, the readers, the surprise might be that marriage to Ruth is not first mentioned. He doesn't mention that first. The first issue is the ownership of the land. Naomi was selling, quote, the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech, and it says in verse 3. Now, we, the readers here, have been led to believe that Naomi has no resources whatsoever. She is so poor that Ruth must go and glean daily. Yet, given the biblical laws restricting the dispersal of the inherited land, it's reasonable that Elimelech would have had property to which his heir would have some right. It's not brought up ever before, but now it is brought up. This may be a surprise because we have not been informed about the legal status of Elimelech's land after his death or about Naomi's entitlement to it. So what has happened to the land? We'll detail that a little bit later. Well, bottom line, Scripture doesn't tell us. There are some opinions out there, and commentators they suspect what might have happened, and we'll look more at that, but Scripture doesn't say. Naomi, as Elimelech's widow, had the right, but not the means, to redeem and work the land. It is this right of redemption and the subsequent or the following use that she offered here to the closer relative. According to Mosaic law in Leviticus 25 and verse 23, land was never to leave the family and the institution of a redeemer. And the institution of a redeemer was set up to prevent that from happening. Now the text says, Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land. The word sell there is makar. I know you were anxiously wondering what that word was. Makar. Now you know a Hebrew word, makar, sell. More often it means the exchange of goods or the transfer of unconditional rights to sell. But the word, however, can refer to a transaction in which only the use of land is transferred for a fixed value for a specific period of time. In other words, to hand over, to co-sign, to transfer, to deliver, to surrender the rights to, according to Leviticus 25 and verses 14 through 16. So what the word can mean is, I give you the rights to the land for a certain period of time. In other words, it's my land, you can work it, and you have the benefits of reaping the crop. There may be, in the conditions, there may be, just give me 50 pounds of barley from this land. That's all I want. You can have everything else. You take care of the land. There may be some sort of arrangement like that. That's what we're talking about here. The word can refer to that transaction, which only the use of the land is transferred for a fixed value for a specific period of time. What is in view here is the right of using the land or the property of someone else's, enjoying the profits without wasting its substance. Naomi is not selling the land. It is not hers to sell. It's her husband's. This is the transfer of land to the nearest relative until the next Jubilee year. Jubilee, I don't know if you've heard or studied that or anything. Leviticus 23, verses 23 through 28, and Leviticus 27 talks about the Jubilee year, the 50th year. Everything goes back to its original owner, the 50th year. The phrase that you see here, our brother Elimelech, at the very end of verse 3, it falls short of concluding that Elimelech, Boaz, and the relative were actually blood brothers. The reason I say that is because the Hebrew word translated here, brother, often refers to relatives besides blood brothers. In other words, in Genesis 14 and Genesis 29, it refers to nephews. Relatives possibly related by marriage. An example there would be 2 Kings chapter 10 and verse 13. Or members of the same tribe. And Numbers chapter 16 and Judges chapter 14. So the relationship of Boaz to the family of Elimelech has been described only in general terms. Our relative, our closest relatives, back in chapter 2 and verse 21, and chapter 3, verse 2. Boaz, our kinsman, with whose maids you were. So somehow he's related, and it could be nephew, uncle, those kinds of things. So it's not literally blood brothers there. It doesn't have to be. Consequently, we do not know the exact relationship of the men to one another. It would be nice to know this. It would help us in our understanding of the responsibilities that family members have, but we do not. The vagueness of the language and the mood or the tenor of the story suggests the relationship was a distant one, not real close. Verse 4. In verse 4, so I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here. This is the only communication that Boaz has with the closer relative. It's the only thing that we see here. Nevertheless, it is a command. Boaz does command him here. It's a challenge to the relative to fulfill his obligations regarding Elimelech's field. The term buy that you have there, do you want to know what the term buy is? Makar, sell. Do you want to know what buy is? So you can learn 2 Hebrew words tonight. Kana. Kana. There you go. Sell or buy. Kana. It ordinarily connotes an unconditional transfer. Most often acquiring property, goods, things like that. Even abstract knowledge, such as wisdom and knowledge, according to Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 5. But it's preferable here to use a general term, require or accept the rights to. So he says to her, I thought to inform you, buy it before, acquire this, accept this, assume the rights to this. And as mentioned above, it's not a purchase in the absolute sense, but a transfer of rights. So given the situation of Naomi, the only circumstance foreseen under which land may be sold is the pressure of poverty in Leviticus 25. And any such sale is made subject to the right of redemption. That's Leviticus 25 and verse 24. Leviticus 25 is an important chapter. And perhaps we should have gone back before and studied it for a week before we come to this. In Leviticus 25, the law spells out 3 different conditions under which land subject to sale reverts to the original owner, or at least to the original owner's family. 1, the seller's closest redeemer must come and redeem the sale of his brother. Leviticus 25 and verse 25. 2, if the seller has no redeemer but recovers sufficient funds, he may purchase the land himself. Or, number 3, if neither of these is possible, in the year of Jubilee, the land reverts to the seller without payment. So according to the Levitical law, those were the three conditions under which land subject to sale reverts to the original owner. What arrangements were made concerning the land while the family was in Moab? We're going to try to answer that now, or see what some of the commentator says. We're not told when Elimelech and Naomi left and went to Moab. We're not told what happened to the land. We're not told what happened to the land when they came back. Only at this point, when it comes to the security of Ruth, is this land now a concern. So what arrangements were made? Again, the text doesn't give us any clues, but the way Boaz and Naomi have acted and what has been said does make the potential endless options a bit more narrow. In other words, we have, based on their interaction with one another, we can narrow this thing down just a bit. Quoting one commentator, he says this: here are so many ambiguities, uncertainties, and unknowns confront us that any final solution to the problems involved will doubtless permanently escape us. Nevertheless, in spite of these difficulties and uncertainties, he writes, I shall adopt as my working hypothesis the view that most of these uncertainties arise from our lack of the socio-legal customs and institutions that regulated such real estate transactions and family obligations in ancient Israel. We operate from that area of ignorance rather than the author's ignorance. The author knows what's going on. The problem is we don't. It's tough for us to get inside and understand precisely what he's saying because he doesn't give us a great deal of detail. But he understands all of these. In fact, he says in verse 7, he tells us the custom of taking off the shoe was an old custom, which tells us that this was written well after this actually happened. How long after, then people speculate. Was it during David's time? Probably not, because look what it says. This was the custom in former times in Israel. So whatever that custom was in earlier years of Israel, whenever this writer is writing this, it was not the custom then. We don't see any kind of regulation in the law regarding this shoe, taking off a shoe as a sign or anything, though we'll look at that a little bit closer a little bit later. So he's referring to a custom in former times. So our ignorance is from understanding the legal customs and the institutions rather than the author's ignorance. First of all, we cannot take the verb to sell to imply that Naomi sold the land sometime in the past. We can't do that. She could hardly have done so from Moab after her husband's death. And the principle of credibility rules out the possibility that she could have done so since her return, because she and Ruth have been living as paupers. They have no means of purchasing anything. There's no indication that they have any means of purchasing anything. This being the case, there are only two broad scenarios possible in understanding the situation. And here they are. One, Elimelech sold the use of his land before leaving the country to Moab, and the field since then has been in the possession of others. Now Naomi is calling upon the closer redeemer, the closer kinsman, to repurchase the field from its present possessor. The transaction is then a case of redemption, such as described in Leviticus 25 in verse 25. That's one scenario, one possibility. Here's a second one. Elimelech did not sell the use of his land prior to immigrating, and Naomi now has the right to all privileges of the land. Naomi, through Boaz, is calling upon the nearest redeemer to acquire these rights from her. The transaction is then a case of preemption, such as related in Jeremiah chapter 32 in verses 6 through 10. And the first scenario is most likely. That is, Elimelech sold the use of the land. We're going to go away because it's a drought here. So he sold the use of his land, and he probably didn't sell it for very much because it was a drought. And what am I going to do? I already have a field that nothing grows in. Why do I want another field that nothing grows in? So he probably sold it for, as we say, pennies on the dollar. But that man had the use of the land, and if he was able to grow anything, he benefited from it. He could sell it, make more money, or have more food, whatever. But that first scenario most likely is the proper one for the following reasons. Naomi and Ruth returned from Moab destitute. She's not just referring to the loss of her husband and sons, for in order to gain sustenance for the two of them, Ruth must stoop to the vocation of the poverty-stricken and glean in the field as a pauper. And she does that in chapter 2. The coherence and the credibility of the story require that Elimelech must have sold the use of his field before leaving for Moab. For Naomi and Ruth clearly have no access to it or its produce. That's why she's gleaning in another man's field. That's the one reason. Here's a second reason. Since agricultural land is far too valuable and essential to the ongoing life of the community for such land to lie abandoned or fallow while its owner was absent for an extended period, we must presume that Elimelech would have left the land in the care of family or someone else appropriated that abandoned property. It's hard to imagine that he would have abandoned property. Remember, this is an agricultural society. If it didn't grow, you didn't eat. And if you didn't eat, you didn't live. So you had to grow stuff. That was imperative to live. So to leave a plot of land, however big it was, completely fallow, that's ridiculous. That means somebody's going to go hungry. And nobody wanted that. A third reason, if Naomi has the right of possession and the use of the land, why is she not present? And there is no mention of purchase price, a detail which in other cases seem to be extremely particular. To be legally binding as the seller to be legally binding, the seller has to be present, and details including the purchase price have to be specific. As in the second case that we said was the second of the two possibilities up there. A fourth reason why we think that Elimelech sold the use of his land before leaving the country to Moab is that Naomi, as the wife of the deceased, has the right to the use of the field of her husband, and hence the right to redeem it. In other words, to buy it back from whomever now is in possession of it. It's these rights that Boaz states she is offering to transfer to Elimelech's nearest relative. Since she is a woman, has little or no legal standing in the matter, nor the means to redeem the field, this is what's going on. And this is what Boaz offers to the near kinsman. And then he says in verse 5, along with the land comes Ruth as well. So therefore Boaz calls on the closest relative to exercise his rights and redeem the field. And the first round of talks ends with the closer relative responding, I will redeem it. So at this point, he's willing to take the field. He's willing to take the field. This is all good for him. This means that he has not only my own land, but now I have this other plot of land, however large it may be. I have the manpower to plant and to harvest. I can make money. This is good for me. This is a good deal. Some questions that I've wrote out in my notes here. Where did Boaz go to resolve the issue of who would be the kinsman for Ruth? He went to the gate of the city. Several questions. Who did Boaz ask to sit as witnesses? We asked 10 men of the elders. What did Boaz first ask the other kinsman to redeem if he wished? He asked him to redeem the parcel of land owned by Elimelech. Verse 3. What did Boaz first ask the other kinsman to redeem if he wished? And he asked him to redeem the parcel of land owned by Elimelech in verse 4. What was the other kinsman's answer? I will redeem it, verse 4. So what has happened? Boaz has used levirate marriage in a clever ploy to secure the estate of the two destitute widows, Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth, those two widows. At a legal forum held at the city gate, Boaz announces that Naomi is selling property or the right to redeem property and suggested that the kinsman holding first right of refusal purchase it. Now, we as the readers are a bit puzzled at this point as to why Ruth's name has not been mentioned at this point. And if she is watching all this take place, her heart must have sunk. Because she's made a marriage proposal in chapter 3. And he said, I'll do this. But if this nearer kinsman wants to do it, then he will redeem you. So if she's watching this, she just heard this nearer kinsman say, I will redeem it. Uh-oh. Boaz is out of the picture now. I'm stuck with this other guy. That's what Ruth is thinking, if she's there. Oh my. These arranged marriages, I'm not liking this at this point. While the relative has agreed to redeem, she probably doesn't have this situation in mind. So the second round takes place. And the second round is in verses 5 through 8. We read that passage. And to this point, Boaz said, on the day you buy it, the field, from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. Well, to this point in the story, Boaz has concentrated efforts resolving the issue of Elimelech's land. Now he introduces Ruth as a complication to the case. She is introduced by her full name, Ruth the Moabitess, intending either to clearly identify Ruth or to cast doubts about the wisdom of requiring the rights to Elimelech's land in the mind of the relative. You also have to take Ruth, who's not an Israelite, who's from a foreign land, who grew up worshiping Chemosh. Do you want to take her too? So Ruth the Moabitess clearly identifies her, and it may be his intention is to cast her in a little bit of a negative light. But he knows, all the people in my city know that you are a woman of excellence. Now, does the nearest relative live in Bethlehem? We're not told. Whether he lives in Bethlehem or whether he's in another little small village close by. But this is the way he introduces her. Maybe Boaz is counting on a measure of anti-Moabite sentiment on the part of the relative. He also introduced her as the widow of the deceased, but her husband is not specifically named until verse 10, Mahlon. From the information in chapter 3, verse 13, the relative must have known about Naomi and Ruth. 3:13. The text says, remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, he, presuming there that he knows something about Naomi and Ruth. The part of the deal that turned the tide from the relative to Boaz is the purpose clause at the end of verse 5. In order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. That phrase there, to raise up the name, occurs only here and in verse 10. And there are two passages that are closely and clearly parallel in meaning. And Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10, outlines the obligation of the Levirate, and Genesis 38, 6 through 26, where the Levirate obligation figures prominently. We have two cases where you see this. The Deuteronomy specifics gives the specifics where a man died without leaving a son. The brother of the deceased would take the wife of the deceased as his wife. and the first son of that union would be given the name of the deceased. If the man refuses, even after the elders talk to him, then the wife of the deceased goes, quote, to him in the sight of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall declare, thus it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. So there's a reference to taking off the sandal. Down in chapter 4, verse 7, when he's writing this story, that was a custom in former times. So if this man is unwilling to do this, she is to take his sandal off and spit in his face and say, thus it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. In a similar way, in Genesis 38, there the situation is where E-R, Judah's oldest son, dies. Judah tells Onan, his second son, to have sexual relations with Tamar and to perform the duty of a husband's brother for her and raise up offspring for your brother. The word name is not literal. It is the designation for the memory of a person, the personification, the picture of the deeds and the achievements, the honor and reputation of that person. You raise up the name, referring to the deeds, achievements, and the honor, the reputation. In this sense, it is the virtual equivalent of descendants or posterity. Raise up posterity, raise up descendants. So the phrase does not mean that the son born will literally bear the name of the deceased. And the phrase there, to produce descendants for the deceased, is very similar to the situation in Ruth 4, and understandably the reason so many conclude that marriage in Ruth is either a levirate marriage or a custom very closely related. So a lot of people will say, well, this is a levirate marriage. He has the responsibility to do this. Look at Deuteronomy 25. Look at Genesis 38. But there are significant differences between those. Deuteronomy 25, the legal provision is limited to the eldest brother. No other brother is mentioned. If the designated brother is unwilling, there is no other provision for the transfer of obligation, not even a distant relative. So there you have a significance difference. The circumstance is the same in Genesis 38. The refusal involved the penalty of public humiliation when violated, which did not occur in Ruth. The widow had a legal right to initiate public legal action before the proper legal form, which would bring about bring upon the refusing brother-in-law all the coercion that custom and precedent would allow. It seems a large risk to the relative who in fact did not agree to marry Ruth. But the situation in Ruth does not in any way have the binding character of legal formulation. Boaz throughout is depicted as a man of exemplary character and honor, has not made a single move up to this point that would indicate that he is in any way subject to such legal obligation. Neither Naomi or Ruth has acted in a manner that would suggest that they had any such legal right. Their reactions are reactions to God's good providence in their life, not expressing their rights and wondering why their rights have not been fulfilled yet. Rather than pursuing legal action to bring about a marriage to the nearest relative, Naomi resorted to a plan covered in darkness. Very risky plan that we saw in chapter 3. What is clear is that a moral obligation, a family responsibility on the next of kin did exist. That did exist. So verse 6, The closest relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You may have the right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. When he says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I jeopardize my own inheritance, the question is, how could this addition of Ruth threaten the relative's estate? That's pretty much jumps out to us. The word jeopardize in this context means either to destroy, as in Genesis 18 and Genesis 6, or to ruin or seriously damage. For example, in Judges chapter 6 and verse 4, and 1 Samuel chapter 6 and verse 5. Regardless of the meaning here, the relative clearly foresees his estate being endangered in some way. So as an answer, lay aside quickly the proposal by some that the relative did not know of Ruth. Boaz knew about Ruth before he met her. In chapter 2, verse 11, the whole town apparently saw her arrival in chapter 1, verse 19, and knew about her as well in chapter 3 and verse 11. If the relative had possession of the land and it could not be taken from him in any way, or if it could be taken from him only by reimbursing him for his purchase, then there's no conceivable way that his estate could seriously be threatened by the transaction. So in light of that discussion, the type of redemption here must be redemption proper. In other words, the repurchase of the land of Elimelech from a third party to whom the land was previously sold. From a third party. So what we're suggesting here is that Elimelech's land is in possession of someone else. Now the family is moving to get that land back from this third party, whoever it is. And so Boaz says to this guy, the nearest relative, will you go over here and redeem this land, get it back into the family? Ruth comes along with it, and he says no. So he's going to do it. This type of redemption gave the relative neither an unconditional nor a reimbursable right to the possession and usage of the redeemed land. So when the relative added up the cost of purchasing the land, plus the cost of caring for Naomi, plus the cost of marrying Ruth, he must have decided that this was not a wise decision. Perhaps Ruth's ethnic origin figured in the equation somehow as well. But his statement is clear. I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. The object, it. Redeem it. The it is not expressed, as in verse 4 too. Most immediate is Ruth, since Boaz has just called on him to exercise family responsibility. But the relative has first in mind the field of Elimelech as well as Ruth. His refusal to act as a redeemer is emphatic. So the relative says to Boaz, you then take on the responsibility in verse 8. By it yourself. You then take on. So let's attempt to pull all this information together in order to clarify. Boaz convenes a legal assembly, verses 1 and 2, and informs the closer kinsman that Naomi is surrendering her right to the field of Elimelech. She has no means of farming. She has no means of purchasing it. As the widow of the deceased, she has the legal right of using and enjoying the fruits or the profits of the land belonging to her husband as long as she lives. But since the land stands in need of redemption, there's a third party who likely owns it, and she has neither the means nor the legal standing to redeem it, she is surrendering her rights to the nearer kinsman, who is also the eventual heir, since Elimelech and Mahlon have died childless. Levirate law cannot be invoked since there are no brothers, and this allows the nearer kinsman to quietly, without embarrassment, opt out of family responsibility to marry Ruth in verse 4. Boaz publicly calls upon the kinsman to take on voluntary family responsibility of marrying Ruth and of producing descendants for the deceased on his inheritance. That's in verse 5. He is now caught in an ethical and an economic dilemma. He has three options to choose from. One, while not legally bound, he could accept moral responsibility for Elimelech's estate, redeem the field, marry Ruth, and ensure the well-being of Naomi. That's certainly the honorable course to follow, the honorable course of action. Two, he could reject the offer, thereby surrender the rights to the land and the responsibility of raising up the name of the deceased to Boaz. Surrender the rights of the land and the responsibility of raising up the name of the deceased to Boaz. He could give up and say, Boaz, you can do it. And this move would not necessarily have been irresponsible. After all, Boaz intimated that his interest in assuming the role of redeemer by declaring that he was next in line. He said that in verse 4. If you're not going to do it, then I will. So it's not an irresponsible move necessarily on the nearer kinsman. He's not going to be leaving Naomi and Ruth out in the street, so to speak. That's the second option. The third option, he could accept responsibility of a redeemer and acquire the field, but reject the responsibility of marrying Ruth and yield to Boaz the moral obligation and or the right to marry Ruth. This would doubtless have cost him considerably in terms of respect and honor in the community. Yes, I want the land. No, I don't want to take care of two widows. Are you kidding? But I want the land. Well, you're going to take a huge hit as far as your reputation goes. And in these days, your reputation meant something. Today, not much. Go on, take the money and run, right? The old song? That's what they do today. Take the money and run. Yeah, you can think of me what you will, but I'll be laughing all the way to the bank kind of approach that people take these days. It would have cost him considerably in terms of respect and honor in the community in the short range, and in the long range terms could have proved economically uncertain. Boaz could produce an heir who later might claim the land. Remember, the land never goes out of the family necessarily. So here is a direct descendant of Mahlon, of Elimelech, Mahlon, Boaz's son. If he marries Ruth, Boaz's son, who might have legal right to claim the land. So those are his three options. Some explanation is now given of the legal system. It says there, in former times, verse 4. Apparently the custom was not in use when Ruth was written. It had been so long since this custom was practiced that it needed an explanation for the current readers of the day. The phrase may refer to a previous time of a generation or less. For example, in Judges chapter 3 and Job chapter 42. It could refer to a long period, as in 1 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 20. It could refer to ancient antiquity in Psalm 102 and verse 26. So that phrase, in former times, is used in all three of those cases. So you have to look at the context and decide how far back we're talking. This action is prescribed in Deuteronomy 25 verses 9 and 10 when the brother of a deceased refuses to marry the widow of the deceased. The widow then symbolically humiliated the man by removing his sandal and spitting in his face. Wow. We read that just a moment ago. The action is not simply a show of anger, but publicly reflected her feelings and the feelings of those in the community about the man's refusal. The removal of the sandal indicated that the brother had abandoned his responsibility and therefore deserved the shame symbolized by the spitting. Wow, again. There was no divine law prescribing this. It was simply an ancient custom. One Manners and Customs. There are books called Manners and Customs books, which are written specifically on these social kind of issues. And this book is called Manners and Customs of the Bible by James Freeman. It's reprint in 1972. He says this, quote, "It probably originated from the fact that the right to tread the soil belonged only to the owner of it, and hence the transfer of a sandal was a very appropriate representation of the transfer of property. The custom was prevalent among the Indians and ancient Germans and is said still to exist in the East." The purpose of this legal gesture is to confirm, to put into effect any matter that was the manner of attestation or the manner of legalization in Israel, there in verse 7. And so with the transfer of the sandal, the official court proceedings were complete. The relative, in relinquishing or handing over his rights, disappears from history, never to be heard from again, except perhaps in heaven. Boaz's response comes in verses 9 and 10, for which we would have to wait for next week. But you can read it, just in case you're on the edge of your seat and you can't wait. Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be cut off from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today." And the second scene begins in verse 13. Whew. Any questions? You had a double barrel. A lot of information this morning and a lot tonight. Any questions? No questions? I hope this is encouraging. This, again, as we've said so many times, God is not on the front pages of this, but He is behind the scene. If you were to flip the house lights on, you would see God behind the scenes doing this and taking things and making them happen, causing them to happen. We're just reading about the human side, the human explanation of all these events. God is behind all of this. God is ensuring that this nearer kinsman would not accept, that he would reject this. God put it in his heart to reject it. God put it in the heart of Boaz to accept it. All of these things. Okay, Father,